Hello everyone, I'm Vinod and I'm adjunct faculty at IIT Palakkad. I'm going to be talking about an interesting topic, which is how do you choose between MS and PhD programs. So we'll talk through a 14-point framework to help you understand how to make these decisions. I'm going to divide these 14 points under three broad categories. One is admissions, graduate admissions. The second one is the nature of the program. The third one is the post-program goals. So let's jump straight in. So in terms of admissions for graduate schools in the US, it is actually way more difficult to be accepted in PhD programs compared to MS programs. For example, if you want to get into a PhD program, you're going to be competing with the best students from across the world. So you have to stand out in terms of how awesome you are. And it's not just applicants from India. It's not just that you are the best student from India. You're competing with the best students from Korea, from Japan, from China, from the Middle East, from South America, from Europe, from UK, and so on. So lots of competition. So you really have to be the best of the best. This competition is particularly acute for PhD programs because most people who try for PhD programs have to show demonstrated expertise in doing research. And when I say demonstrated expertise, I'm talking about possibly publications in tier one journals. And even if a publication is under review, that's also okay. So there's a pretty high bar when it comes to subjects like computer science because everybody is above average in computer science. So if you want to study the best universities in the world, so you've got to be among the best in the world, and it's really, really competitive. So if you're in a field like computer science, electrical engineering, electronics, it's probably a little easier to apply for master's programs like MS program compared to PhD programs. And even in other subjects like mechanical, civil, and other types of engineering, it is way more difficult to get accepted into a PhD program. The chances of acceptance in a PhD program is typically between, say, 3 to 10%. And you will see that the admissions rate for master's programs, especially the MS program, is somewhere between 15 to 25%. So there's a much higher chance, clearly. Point number two, let's talk about GRE scores. So typically, if you want to be considered for PhD programs, you need to have above the 90th percentile in your verbal and quantitative section. At the same time, if you want to apply for a master's program, maybe the 80th percentile is enough, maybe 85th percentile is enough. So you really have to stand out in the admissions process. So in case you are not submitting your GRE scores, you need to have an exemplary track record. You need to have great letters of recommendation. You need a very good statement of purpose. You need to have done a lot of research. Remember, a PhD is all about research. So the more research potential you can demonstrate by doing internships or even having a little bit of full-time work experience, like you work for a couple of years, that makes you a better candidate for a PhD program. I've seen people in the US where they come for a PhD program in their late 20s, mid 30s, late 30s, early 40s, sometimes even in between 50 to 60 and so on. So there's nothing called a right age range for a PhD program. You apply for it when you're ready. That can happen anytime in your career. So that's about GRE scores. Third piece, which is also important when it comes to the admissions idea, is that you're looking at funding as important criteria. So when you talk about funding, most master's programs in the US do not give any type of funding. You will have to sponsor most of that yourself. But for a PhD program in the US, funding is guaranteed. And this is similarly case with most PhD programs, even in Europe, where you get full funding for PhD programs. So if you are from a middle class background and if you cannot show the amount listed in your visa, before the visa consular, if you don't have enough funds to show to get a visa stamp for your MS degree, then maybe you should consider a PhD degree. And what is the cost we are talking about? So when it comes to MS program, we're talking about something like $50,000 to $70,000 per year in terms of tuition fees, and then another $10,000 to $20,000 in terms of living expenses. That's for 1 year. So for 2 years, you could be expected to show again something between $150,000 to $180,000. Mostly before the visa consulate officer, they only need you to show 1 year of funds. So that way you can get away, but still it's a large amount, anything between say $50,000 to $80,000. So what you have to do is you got to probably mortgage your house or at least get a loan in your name, or you may want to get some sort of certificate from a bank saying you have access to so much property and wealth. And not everyone can afford it. If you're a middle class person or you're not from a great background, then maybe showing this amount of funds is going to be a problem. Then you should consider doing a PhD program, because in most PhD programs, you get something called a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship. And in both cases, they typically waive off your tuition and also pay you a stipend in addition to it. So the stipend can be pretty lucrative. So I have a mentee who's at Purdue University and who's getting around $2,500 a month. And he pays something like $700, $800 for all his expenses, and he's able to save more than $1,000, more than $1,500 a month. So that's the advantage of doing a PhD program, that you can actually save a lot of money if you're thoughtful. The same way, if you're doing a master's program, you should not only account for the tuition fees, but also for the cost of living in the US. And you're close to a big city, it can be frightfully expensive. So you have to probably spend around $2,000 to $3,000 a month living in a big city like New York or San Francisco. So factor in all these things. If you do not have enough funds, you may want to not apply to these colleges near the big cities. Or instead, you may want to go to a more remote location like the Midwest, where the cost of living is much cheaper. Okay, let's jump to the second category, which is the nature of the program. In terms of the duration of the master's program, it's typically around 2 years for an MS program. I know folks who have done it for 2.5 years, sometimes very, very rarely 3 years, but 2 years is like an average number you need to commit. And for a PhD program, the average commitment is approximately 5 years, but then it's an average number, which means that it's generally not less than 5 years. There are some rare cases of people who do it within 4 years, but that's so rare. Most people take 5 years or more. Most take 5 to 6 years. So that's a safe number. In case you're asked to given feedback by a thesis committee that you will have to do some revisions and then submit your thesis again, it may take some extra time. So for your PhD thesis, it can range from 5 years to 6 years. There can also be some additional expectations. For example, some universities have an expectation that you end up making a publication in a tier 1 journal. And tier 1 journal publications could take you a really long time. It could take you between 3 to 4 years of your life. So it is not easy to get these publications done. And sometimes the PhD wait time may actually grow out to be very long. I know people who have gone to great universities like MIT and Berkeley. Some have spent 8 years doing a PhD. I know one person who went to MIT and actually took 10 years to finish his PhD. So again, it all depends in terms of how awesome your advisor is for the PhD program. If something happened in between, for example, I know a person who joined one university, then his professor moved to a different university, then he tagged along with his professor and went to the new university. If you go from one location to the other, it may require 1 year of adjustment to this new location. So that might again mean that your PhD duration stretches out. A good thing to keep in mind is that you want to work with someone who's probably not an assistant professor for a PhD program, because in most assistant professor roles, after 6 years as being an assistant professor, they become eligible for tenure. And what that means is that not everyone gets tenure. A lot of people do not get tenure in the US. So that means that if you are, say, in a top 10 university and do not get tenure as a professor, you will move to, say, a university between ranks 20 to 30. And if you're in a university between rank 20 to 30, if you do not get tenure, you move to a college ranked between, say, 40 to 50. So you keep falling down till you get to the right location in terms of rankings. Imagine you're working with an assistant professor, and within 2-3 years, your professor is eligible for tenure, and he doesn't get tenure, then he's going to go to a lower ranked university. So that can cause a lot of trouble in terms of should you follow the professor, should you shift to a new professor and guide, and that can actually lead to an extension of your PhD thesis. So factor in all these things. Maybe working with assistant professors is not a great idea. Likewise, working with full professors is also not a great idea sometimes, because these full professors already have tenure. They have a lot of job security. They can do whatever research they want. They don't necessarily focus on research which is attractive to students. And what is attractive to the job market? They do blue sky research, which means that they do research on random topics. And sometimes it is not easy to work with these professors. They do not spend enough time with students. I'm sure there are always exceptions, but many professors don't spend enough time with the students. They delegate the work of being with the students to their research scientists in the lab, maybe the older PhD students in the lab. And in many cases, if you think that you've got a program or a chance to work with a top researcher in your space, check if that person is a full professor, because in most cases, people do not work with the full professor. They're only working with the research scientists, the postdocs, and the senior PhD students in the lab. So ideally, you want to be with a person who's somewhere like being an associate professor, who is not yet a full professor, who still has a fire to do research, and who's just recently got tenure. So they still have the fire in the belly to do great research and is still hardworking and is able to also spend enough time with you. Maybe the worry of tenure is over so that they can spend more time with students and guiding them and mentoring them. So those are really the people to target. Okay, so again, when it comes to duration commitment, MS 2 years, PhD between 5 to 6 years. Let's look at career goals. So you've got to ask yourself, what is it you're really planning to do? So for example, if you really want to be in industry, then maybe you should get to industry as fast as possible. And in that way, an MS program can really help you out, because within 2 years, you're working in industry. And in many places, the starting compensation is north of $80,000 to $85,000 a year. Even in mechanical engineering, you could easily get above $85,000 to $90,000 a year by working in the US if you have a PhD in mechanical engineering or in any of the core branches. If you're in computer science, electrical engineering, you will easily make more than $110,000, $120,000 a year. So again, if you want to work in industry, maybe master's is the right place for you. In fact, when you write your PhD statement of purpose, you need to actually say what is it you want to do when you finish your PhD program. And do not mention that you want to work in industry, because professors don't like it. They expect all PhD students to contribute to research in an academic setting. So the thumb rule is that PhD is to train people to become researchers in universities. It's a different thing that doesn't happen and some people end up in industry, but the idea is to train you for academia. So do talk about that in your statement of purpose. What are the opportunity costs? There's something you need to always factor in. So for example, if you're doing a master's program, what that means is, for example, after you finish undergrad program, you have the chance to work in a company for a couple of years, but then you decide not to work in a company and you do a master's program. So what you're doing during that time is that you're not just paying for the cost of tuition, but also the living expenses in the master's program, but there's also income foregone, which you're not making because you're not working anymore for the 2 years. So whatever you get in terms of income after your master's program, you should also account for the fact that you lost a lot of tuition fees, you lost a lot of living expenses, and there's also opportunity because you're not working for 2 years. You didn't gain enough work experience. You also did not make money for the 2 years. So this also has to be factored in into the calculations. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're going for a PhD program, which is 5 to 6 years, the opportunity cost is much higher. So again, you've got to ask yourself, is it really worth not getting 5 years of work experience? And instead of that, do a PhD? And that's an answer only you can give. Okay, so let's look at another factor, which is geographical proximity. So I mentioned earlier that you've got to be close to a big city if you want to get into some of these famous multinational companies, because most of them are located close to these big cities. That's where the jobs are. If you're in a remote location, it's much more difficult to find good jobs. For example, when I was in Wisconsin, Madison, the only good jobs, you had to find them in Chicago or in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, there are only two big employers. One was General Mills, the other one is Cargill. There are a lot of smaller companies, of course. But again, if you want to work, for example, in a big tech company, in an IT company, then you have to be close to Seattle. You've got to be close to San Francisco. You've got to be close to Austin in Texas. These really are the tech hubs. Or you need to be near the Research Triangle Park, which is near Raleigh and Durham in North Carolina. That's a place to be. So Research Triangle Park, Austin, San Francisco Bay Area, and Seattle. These are the big tech clusters, and you've got to be near these locations. These places are also frightfully expensive. So if you're doing a master's program, you've got to ask yourself, are these places affordable, or is it possible for me to use my limited budget to live in these places? There's always a chance you'll find scholarship because even when you do a master's program, you're always looking out for assistantships. And universities do provide assistantships. You could get an RA, research assistantship, or a teaching assistantship, and both of them waive your tuition fees. But then 30% of students who join a university for the master's program get an assistantship after the first year. Another 30% get it after the end of the second semester. So 30% at the end of the first semester, another 30% at the end of the second semester. So by the end of the first year, around 60% of people have got some sort of internship, but I mean, some sort of assistantship. But do remember that 40% of students do not get assistantships and they have to pay the full cost of tuition. So majority of people do find assistantships during the master's program, but there's also a substantial chunk who do not get assistantships. So you don't want to be in the situation where you do not get assistantship and then you're like, what should I be doing? Because the options are very limited. You may have to come back to India. So whatever you have, make sure that enough funds to cover both years of tuition before you go to the US. And don't bet that you will 100% get an assistantship after the first semester or after the second semester, because it may or may not happen. So factor that. One way to optimize this is that consider colleges in Texas, for example, where the tuition fees are much, much lower. Recently, a student messaged me. He's in one of those universities in Texas where the tuition fees is just $8,000 a year. So instead of going to a place like Stanford or Berkeley, where the tuition is much higher, probably $60,000 to $70,000, you may want to consider going to a not so well-known university in a more remote place where there are a lot of jobs. Like Texas and California is where the jobs are. And also the cost of tuition is much lesser. So do your search and optimize accordingly. Let's look at one more factor, which is academia versus industry. So most people who finish a PhD are expected to get into academia. But you know what? Getting into academia is also tough because after a PhD, you will have to commit around 3 years for doing something called a postdoc, which is around, ranges from 2 to 3 years. But ideally, if you get into academia, you finish a PhD, then do a postdoc, and then enter academia. You'll ask me, why does it happen this way? The answer is that there's too much competition among PhD graduates to get into academia as an assistant professor. So what they do is that they increase entry level barriers and say that only people with postdoc experience can actually apply for jobs in academia. So this means that you have to have a postdoc. And during this time of postdoc, you're not making much. You're probably making between, say, $40,000 to $60,000 a year, which is really bad. It's much lower than what you could make in industry. So just factor in the opportunity cost. You're working as a postdoc, you're not making enough money, while your friends are making a lot more money who've just done their MS and who have been working for probably 3 plus 3, 6 more years than you. They're making way more than you. And then when you join academia, how much are you going to make? So ask all these questions and then decide what is right for you. There are people who do a PhD also enter industry. And it happens very often in electronics engineering, electrical engineering, semiconductor industries, where they all need people with PhD degrees to enter industry. Again, they can be well-paying, but in terms of the gap between MS and undergraduate compensation, you're talking about a gap of maybe around $10,000 to $15,000 in terms of gap between MS compensation and salaries for PhD graduates. Again, the difference is probably going to be around $10,000. It's not much. The difference is not much. But again, you can have for example, if you want to be working in Google Research Labs, Microsoft Research Labs, you have to have a PhD. You cannot enter there otherwise. So if you really know where you want to be, maybe a PhD makes sense for you. If you want to enter Intel Labs, IBM Labs, they always require a PhD, and MS is not enough. So there are some places where MS works, there are some places where PhD works, and you make the right choice based on what is it you want to do. PhD involves a lot of passion for research. You should not do a PhD unless you're super passionate about research. So the entire process of working in a laboratory, reading of research journals, writing papers, publication, this is something that should be interesting to you. So if you don't have passion, I would say just go for a master's program, not a PhD program. In terms of thesis expectations, you have a thesis committee, you have to convince all of them that you have finished your PhD, and they have very high barriers, they have very high expectations. So there is no way that you can squeak by and take shortcuts for doing a PhD. So do your homework and ask yourself, can I do a hell lot of hard work to get a PhD degree? There's also something called closing of options, which means that if you have done a PhD, pretty much you cannot study further beyond that. Most people do not do a double PhD. So pretty much a PhD is a terminal degree. But then if you do an MS degree and you work for a couple of years, you can always come back later and do a PhD degree. So if you're not made up your mind, you can always do an MS and then come back for a PhD later. I know of people, for example, who say that I want to do a PhD program, and then by the end of the first year, they have the qualifying exams, and they do not clear the PhD qualifiers, and they get kicked out from the PhD program. And sometimes they use it as a way to game the system. They get funding for the PhD program. They get terminated from the PhD program, and they feel that they can get out with a master's degree at no cost. It's pretty risky. I know a couple of people, for example, who have gone to great universities, tried this tactic. That is, they actually wanted an MS degree, but then they applied for a PhD program, got in, and tried to weasel out of the program by failing in the PhD qualifiers. And I would say all this is risky because the one person I'm thinking about was asked to refund the entire cost of the MS program because he was getting kicked out from the PhD program. And to get an MS degree, he was asked to pay for the MS degree. So it all depends on what is it you want. I would say it's better to be honest rather than lie about your true intentions. Let's talk about the post-program goals. When you're looking at the job market, definitely there's a little bit of attraction for the PhD program because clearly you've worked in academia a little longer, you're working in a laboratory, so you know more clearly. But the differential in terms of compensation is not going to be too much. A person who does an MS and works for 3 years is probably going to make a lot more than someone who's finishing a PhD from the same university. So again, job market, is it all about compensation or is it something about what is it you want to get out of the PhD program? So those are questions you've got to ask yourself. One advantage of a PhD program is that you become eligible for something called O1 visa. And all master students typically cannot apply for O1 visa. They can only apply for something like H1B visa. Right now, the chances of getting an H1B is around 10% in the US. So if you want to stay long term in the US, it's very unlikely that you will actually end up getting H1B visa. So you have to seriously consider coming back to India after a master's program. And if you don't get your H1B, but then if you do a PhD program, you could be eligible for the O1 visa, which makes it easier for you to be in the US. So again, if you want to be in the US long term, maybe a PhD program is right for you compared to a master's program. We talked about compensation. The differential is not much between a master's and a PhD program. But there are lots of labs, there are a lot of sectors and industries which really require a PhD degree. And if you're really interested in a specific company or specific sector, do check out the job descriptions of companies and ask yourself, what are they looking for? Look at the JD, scan and see what sort of roles are given to people with PhD degrees versus MS degrees. Then you will see if that gap is substantial enough. Lastly, in terms of career growth, I would say that you've got to be a great people manager if you only have an MS degree. If you want to be a hardcore technical person, a PhD program definitely helps. So if you are just having an MS degree, then you have to become a people manager and you have to build up a lot of additional skills in terms of communication, in terms of people management and so on. But then if you have a PhD degree, you don't need to have the same amount of communication skills or business skills. You can be just an expert in your space and you can rise to the top much faster. In fact, if you look at the CEOs of companies like Micron and other semiconductor companies, all of them have a PhD degree, which means that in those sectors, PhD degrees really count. If you want to be CTO, for example, it's very difficult to be a CTO without a PhD degree. So again, in those cases, PhD works. So ask yourself, how much do you want to rise in a company? Do you want to get into people management? Do you just want to be a technical expert? And this can also be decisive ways to ask and judge whether you're cut out for a PhD degree. Okay, so I shared a lot of points with you. So let me know if all this made sense. Pass your questions in the comments below. I'll try my best to answer it. And do share this video with my friends with your friends, because I think that it's a great way to spread information and know about how to make the right career decisions. Till next time, folks. Cheers and bye-bye.